They didn't arrest her for fraud. They didn't arrest her for lying. They arrested her under a witchcraft law written in 1735, in the middle of World War II, while Britain was fighting for survival. The government locked up a working-class woman and labeled her a threat to national security. Not because she carried weapons, not because she spied for the enemy, but because she spoke to the dead and said something she was never supposed to know. Her name was Helen Duncan. Some believed she could open a door between life and death. Others believed she was one of the most dangerous frauds of her time. And the British state decided it didn't matter which was true, because when a woman knows secrets she shouldn't, truth and lies become equally dangerous. This is the true story of the last woman imprisoned for witchcraft in modern Britain. And the question that still hasn't been answered: was Helen Duncan a con artist? Or did she terrify the government for a reason? In the winter of her final years, Helen Duncan would sit alone in dim rooms and listen to silence as if it were listening back. But long before the courts, before prison walls, before the word witch was dragged out of the past and pressed onto her name, Helen was simply a child, one who made rooms feel uneasy without ever saying a word. She was born in 1897 in the small Scottish town of Callander, a place shaped by stone houses, narrow roads, and a river that moved steadily past fields that rarely changed. Life there followed a strict rhythm: work, church, sleep, day after day. People survived by knowing their place and staying inside it. Helen was born into that order and quietly broke it. Her father, Archibald McFarland, worked with his hands. Cabinet making when there was demand, roofing when there was need. Whatever paid enough to keep food on the table. Her mother, Isabella, ruled the household with discipline and prayer. She was a devoted Presbyterian, the kind of woman who believed that faith was not something you questioned, but something you obeyed. God watched, God judged, and God did not speak through strange feelings or wandering thoughts. Helen was expected to grow into that belief, but from the beginning, something about her unsettled people as a toddler. She would stop suddenly in the middle of play and stare into corners of the room as if something had moved there, not frightened, not curious, just attentive, as though she were listening to something that hadn't spoken out loud. When neighbors noticed, they laughed it off at first. Children were imaginative, children were odd. But as Helen grew older, the laughter stopped. At school, she didn't behave the way other children did. She wasn't disruptive. She didn't misbehave. She simply drifted. Teachers would call her name and she wouldn't answer, not because she was defiant, but because her attention seemed fixed elsewhere. Sometimes, without warning, she would speak, not nonsense, not childish chatter, statements. She won't come back. Something bad is going to happen. There was no drama in her voice when she said these things. No attempt to scare anyone. That was what frightened people the most. The other children began to avoid her. They said it felt cold near her desk. They said she watched them like she knew something they didn't. By the time Helen was 8 years old, she had become the girl people whispered about. Her mother noticed everything. Isabella watched her daughter with tightening concern, especially at night. Helen would wake from sleep pale and shaken, sometimes crying, sometimes silent, insisting she had felt a hand touch her shoulder or heard someone breathe near her ear. Isabella prayed harder. She told Helen to ignore such things, to stop talking about dreams, to stay grounded in the Word. In Scotland, people did not openly talk about witchcraft anymore. The laws were gone. The trials were history, but memory lingered. Everyone knew stories of second sight, of children born too sensitive, of people who saw beyond what they were supposed to see and paid for it. Isabella did not believe her daughter was evil, but she feared vulnerability, because in a world like theirs, being different was dangerous. Helen learned early that silence was safer. She stopped telling people what she felt. She stopped describing the dreams where rooms filled with unfamiliar faces, where voices spoke without mouths, where she stood between people who were alive and people who were not, and somehow belonged to neither. But hiding something does not make it disappear. It only teaches it to wait. By the time Helen reached her early teens, it was clear that school would not hold her. Like most working-class children of the time, she left formal education early and entered the world of labor. There was no ceremony in it, no sense of loss, just another step into adulthood that came too soon. Her first work placements took her far from the quiet order of calendar. She found herself employed near Dundee Royal Infirmary, a place that smelled of antiseptic, damp stone, and exhaustion. Long corridors echoed with footsteps at night. Curtains separated the living from the dying with only thin fabric. For most young girls, it would have been overwhelming. For Helen, it felt familiar. Here, death was not hidden. It was present, regular, almost routine. Men arrived broken by factories. Children burned with fevers that medicine couldn't stop. Women whispered prayers beside beds that would soon be empty. Helen did her tasks quietly, changing linens, carrying supplies, cleaning rooms where someone had taken their final breath hours earlier. And in those rooms, something inside her settled. She felt the same awareness she had known as a child, the same sense that spaces remembered people, that grief did not vanish when a body did. Late at night, walking those corridors, she sometimes paused, not because she was afraid, but because the air felt crowded, as if the hospital never truly slept, as if something was always listening. Helen never spoke of it, but the boundary between life and death, the line everyone else trusted to be solid, was already thinning for her, and she was only just beginning to step across it. By the time Helen Duncan reached adolescence, the town had already decided what she was: not dangerous, not gifted, just odd, in calendar. Labels mattered. They were a way of keeping order. Once a person was named, they could be placed neatly into the social fabric. Helen's label was quiet but permanent. People spoke around her. Not to her. Adults lowered their voices when she passed. Children sensed the rule without being taught it. Leave her alone. Helen learned to move through the world without friction. She kept her head down. She spoke only when spoken to, outwardly. She became the kind of girl no one worried about anymore, but inwardly. Nothing had gone away. School had never offered her shelter. The classroom was rigid, built for repetition and obedience. Chalk scraped across slate boards. Scripture was recited word for word. Any thought that wandered beyond the lesson was corrected swiftly. Helen's mind wandered anyway, not toward fantasy, but toward impressions. A tightening in her chest when someone was about to cry. A heaviness in the air before bad news arrived. A sudden certainty that something unseen had entered a room. Once, during morning lessons, she froze mid-sentence and whispered, "Someone's hurt." The teacher struck the desk and ordered her to stop disrupting the class. An hour later, a child from another room collapsed from a seizure. No one said anything afterward. No apologies. No questions. Coincidence was safer than curiosity. Her mother watched these incidents with mounting fear. Isabella did not scold Helen anymore. She did something far more effective. She erased the subject entirely. Dreams were dismissed. Feelings were forbidden. Silence was praised. At night, Isabella prayed aloud while Helen lay stiff beneath her blanket. Listening to words meant to drive unseen things away. Helen learned to breathe quietly, to keep her thoughts inward, to lock the door to that other awareness as tightly as she could. But doors like that don't stay shut. They leak. As Helen grew older, the sensations changed. They became less sudden, more persistent, not flashes, but a steady pressure, like standing near a river whose current you could feel through the ground. She would wake some mornings with the certainty that something had already happened somewhere else. Other nights, she dreamed of people she had never met, their faces vivid and heavy with emotion. When she woke, the feelings remained. Long after the images faded, she stopped telling anyone. Not because she understood what was happening, but because she understood the cost of speaking. By 12, her formal education ended. That was not unusual. Working-class families needed wages more than books. Helen stepped out of the schoolhouse and into labor without ceremony, trading desks for duties. Her early work took her into environments most children were shielded from, places where suffering was not whispered about, but endured openly. At Dundee Royal Infirmary, she became familiar with death in its most unromantic form. There were no sermons there, no explanations, just bodies that failed. She cleaned floors slick with spilled medicine. She stripped beds after patients were carried away. She watched nurses move with professional calm through grief-stricken families who hovered helplessly at the edges of rooms. At first, Helen tried to look away, but the hospital did not allow avoidance. The dying did not fade quietly. They labored for breath. They clutched hands. They stared at ceilings with expressions that suggested they were seeing something far beyond plaster and beams. Helen noticed something others did not. The moment after death. Not the stillness, but the shift. A room changed when someone died. The air felt altered, as though it had lost tension. Conversations lowered without instruction. People lingered longer than necessary, unsure when it was acceptable to leave. Helen felt it every time, and she felt something else too, a sense that what had been there did not always go far. Late at night, walking empty corridors, she sometimes paused without knowing why. Not from fear, from awareness, the kind that had followed her since childhood. She never saw figures, never heard voices, but she felt presence, not hostile, not comforting, just observant. It was during these years that Helen began to understand something no one had ever explained to her. Whatever she carried inside her was not imagination alone. It reacted to grief. It sharpened around loss. It grew stronger in places where death had passed recently. The hospital did not frighten her. It clarified her. While others hardened or turned numb, Helen became more attuned. She absorbed sorrow the way dry ground absorbs rain, quietly, completely. And when she returned home at night, exhausted and silent, her mother mistook her calm for normalcy. Isabella believed the strange phase had passed. She did not know that Helen had simply learned where it was safe to listen. The world had refused to name what Helen was experiencing, so Helen carried it unnamed, waiting, unaware that the very thing she was trying to keep hidden was already shaping the path she would one day be unable to escape. The longer Helen worked, the more she realized that people around her sensed something. Even if they couldn't explain it, patients spoke to her differently than they did to other attendants. Their voices softened when she approached. Some reached for her hand without asking, gripping tightly as if afraid she might disappear. Others stared at her with a kind of quiet recognition, as though they felt understood without a word being exchanged. Once, an elderly man pulled her close and whispered, "You hear them too, don't you?" Helen didn't answer, not because she didn't understand the question, but because answering felt dangerous. She gently eased her hand from his grip and continued her work, heart pounding harder than it ever had before. That night, she dreamed of him standing at the foot of her bed, not frightening, not demanding, just watching. When she woke, the dream clung to her like damp fabric. Later that day, she learned he had died before sunrise. It happened again and again, not always with people she spoke to, sometimes with those she only passed in hallways. A glance, a pressure in her chest, a sense of soon. She began to dread the feeling, not because she feared death, but because she could not stop anticipating it. Helen was careful, meticulous. She never warned families, never spoke predictions aloud. She understood instinctively that naming things gave them power, and that power could turn on her. Outside the infirmary, life went on in its narrow, familiar grooves. Europe moved closer to war. Wages tightened. Food grew more expensive. People clung harder to routine because routine felt like control. Helen returned home each night to her family's small rooms, helping with chores, listening more than speaking. Her mother praised her steadiness now, her obedience, her silence. Isabella believed her prayers had worked. But at night, when the house fell quiet, Helen lay awake and listened, not outwardly, but inwardly. The awareness never shouted. It never demanded. It waited. Sometimes she felt it as a pressure behind her eyes, other times as a subtle pull, like gravity shifting slightly to one side. She learned that resisting it made her restless, anxious. Letting it exist without engaging brought calm, so she learned to coexist with it. Years passed like this, quietly, uneventfully. Then Helen met Henry Duncan. Henry was everything Helen was not. Solid, grounded, a cabinet maker by trade, like her father, with rough hands and an uncomplicated view of the world. He spoke plainly. He laughed easily. He did not peer into silences looking for meaning. What struck Helen most was not his kindness, but his lack of fear. When she grew distant, he didn't push. When she fell silent, he didn't fill the space. He accepted her presence as it was. They married in 1916, during a world already unraveling under the weight of war. Their home was modest, their life practical. Money was always tight, but Henry worked steadily, and Helen kept the house with quiet efficiency. From the outside, they looked like any other working-class couple. Inside, Helen carried something heavy. Motherhood came quickly, and with it, loss. She became pregnant again and again, and again and again. The children did not stay. Some were stillborn, others lived only days or weeks. 6 tiny lives passed through her arms and vanished before the world could know them. Grief in those years was not discussed. It was endured. Helen did not scream. She did not collapse. She buried her children, returned home, washed the linens, and carried on. But something changed. The awareness she had learned to hold at a distance moved closer. Loss thinned whatever barrier she had built. The dreams returned, not vague impressions, but vivid encounters. Faces she recognized, small hands reaching, voices that felt closer than memory. She began to wonder, not if death ended things, but how much it ended. Henry noticed the change but did not name it. He saw his wife grow quieter, more inward, but he also saw something else, a steadiness that did not break under sorrow. When Helen finally spoke to him about what she felt, not everything, just enough, he did not laugh. He did not accuse. He listened, and that changed everything. For the first time, Helen did not feel entirely alone with what she carried. It was not belief that bound them. Henry never claimed to understand, but he did not forbid her from exploring what she felt. He did not frame it as sin or sickness. He simply allowed it to exist. That permission, quiet and unspoken, opened a door Helen had kept locked for years. At first, she did nothing with it. Then neighbors began to ask questions, quiet ones, careful ones. Do you think they're still with us? Do you ever feel like someone's trying to speak? Helen never advertised herself, never invited attention, but grief has a way of finding those who will listen. And slowly, almost accidentally, people began to gather in her home at night. Just a few at first, chairs drawn into a loose circle, lamps turned low, hands clasped more out of nervousness than ritual. Helen did not call it anything. She simply sat, closed her eyes, and listened. She did not know it yet, but the thing she had spent her life trying to contain had finally found a place to breathe, and once it did, it would never return to silence again. The first gatherings felt less like events and more like confessions. No one announced them. No invitations were written. A neighbor would mention it to a sister would tell a friend whose husband had died in a factory accident, or whose child had not survived the winter fever. By the time Helen noticed what was happening, people were already arriving at her door after dark, hats in their hands, eyes lowered, voices hushed as if they were entering a church. Helen never stood at the center. She never raised her voice. She never promised anything. They sat together in the small room, chairs drawn close, the air thick with coal smoke and expectation. Someone would ask a question, carefully phrased, almost apologetic. Is there anything at all after this? Helen would close her eyes. Not theatrically, not deliberately. It happened the way breathing happened when you stopped thinking about it. At first, there were only sensations, a heaviness in her chest, a tightening behind her eyes, the familiar pressure she had known since childhood, now sharpened by the grief packed tightly into the room. She spoke only when words came naturally, not messages, not prophecies, impressions. She would say things like, "Someone feels unfinished," or "There's a warmth here, like relief." Sometimes she said nothing at all, and yet people left changed. They cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet release that comes when someone finally feels heard. They thanked her even when she insisted she had done nothing. That unsettled her. Helen did not believe she was doing anything. She felt more like a place something passed through. Henry watched from the edges of these gatherings, uneasy but observant. He noticed how Helen's posture shifted when she closed her eyes, how her breathing slowed, how afterward she seemed distant, as though returning from somewhere far away. He also noticed something else. People trusted her, not because she convinced them, but because she never tried to. That trust frightened him. England had no patience for women who drew attention for the wrong reasons, especially women who spoke of things that could not be measured, taxed, or controlled. Henry understood the danger long before Helen did. He warned her gently. "Be careful," he said once, late at night after the last visitor had gone. "People don't like what they can't explain." Helen nodded. She already knew, but something had shifted. The awareness she had carried for so long no longer felt like a burden she could set down. It felt like a responsibility she didn't know how to refuse. As the gatherings continued, The sensations deepened. Helen began to feel physical effects she could not ignore. Tingling along her arms, a pressure in her throat, a sense of something rising slowly, insistently, when she entered that quiet inward state. Once. She opened her eyes afterward and found the room staring at her in stunned silence. Your voice changed, someone whispered. Helen touched her throat. Startled, she had not noticed. Another time, someone swore they felt a hand brush their shoulder, while Helen sat motionless across the room. Helen did not confirm it. She did not deny it. She simply listened. Word spread, not loudly, but steadily. Helen Duncan's name traveled through kitchens and boarding houses, through factory floors and church steps, always accompanied by caution, always wrapped in uncertainty. She doesn't charge. She doesn't perform. She just sits. That made her harder to dismiss. It also made her more dangerous. By the early 1920s, Helen's life had settled into a strange duality. By day, she worked long shifts at the bleach factory, hands raw from chemicals, lungs burning from fumes. By night, she sat in dim rooms with people who believed she stood at the edge of something sacred. She was exhausted, but she was also awake in a way she had never been before. Then came the first moment she could not explain away. During a small gathering, as she sat with her eyes closed, she felt an unfamiliar sensation in her mouth. Cool, damp, heavy. Panic flared for a split second. But the room was so still, so intent, that she did not move. When she opened her eyes afterward, someone gasped. A thin, white substance hung briefly from her lips before falling away. The room erupted into whispers. Ectoplasm. The word was spoken like a prayer and a curse at once. Helen was horrified. She had not felt it form, had not intended it. She ran to wash her mouth, shaking, confused, ashamed. But the people in the room were elated. "This proves it," one said. "They're really here," another whispered. Helen tried to stop the gatherings after that. She truly did. But grief is persistent, and belief, once ignited, does not retreat easily. People begged her to continue. They insisted the manifestations were not frightening. They were evidence, comfort, hope. Henry watched the change with growing concern. He saw how pale she became after each session, how she slept for hours afterward, how her body seemed to pay a price her mind refused to acknowledge. "You don't owe them this," he said. Helen wanted to believe that, but somewhere deep inside her, a truth had begun to take shape. Whatever was happening to her no longer belonged only to her. The world had refused to name what she was for most of her life. Now, others were naming it for her. And once something has a name, it begins to attract attention, not all of it kind. Helen Duncan did not wake up one morning intending to become a medium. There was no ambition in it, no hunger for attention, if anything. Attention unsettled her. She had spent her entire life learning how to avoid being noticed, how to move quietly through rooms, how to keep what was strange about her safely contained. But belief has momentum. And once people began to believe, not cautiously, not privately, but openly, Helen found herself standing at the center of something she could no longer slow down. The gatherings grew larger. What had once been a handful of neighbors became entire rooms filled with strangers. Some traveled from nearby towns. Others arrived clutching letters of introduction written by people Helen had never met. They came with photographs folded carefully in coat pockets, with names written on scraps of paper, with questions rehearsed over sleepless nights. Helen tried to keep the atmosphere restrained. No singing, no dramatics, no promises, but the room itself seemed to change when she closed her eyes. People described it later as a shift, a tightening of the air, a sudden awareness of every breath being drawn in the circle. Helen's posture softened, her head tilting slightly forward, her breathing slowing until it no longer matched the room's rhythm. Sometimes she spoke in a voice that did not feel like her own, not louder, not deeper, just altered, as though something had adjusted its grip on her throat. Those moments frightened her more than anything else. Afterward, she often remembered little, faces blurred, words slipped away like dreams. What remained was exhaustion so complete it felt physical, her limbs heavy, her skin cold, her thoughts distant. Henry worried. He watched his wife return from trances pale and trembling, her strength drained in ways no factory shift had ever caused. He noticed how she sometimes stared at her hands afterward, flexing her fingers as if to reassure herself that she was still fully present. "You're disappearing," he said once, quietly. When no one else could hear, Helen shook her head. She didn't feel gone. She felt opened. And the more she opened, the more people wanted to see. By the late 1920s, Helen's seances had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer intimate gatherings shaped by shared grief. They were becoming events, things people talked about with excitement as much as reverence, and with spectacle came scrutiny. Skeptics began to attend, slipping into circles with arms folded, eyes sharp. They watched Helen closely, noting every movement, every pause, every intake of breath. Some whispered among themselves. Others sat in silence, waiting for a mistake. Helen sensed them immediately. The atmosphere changed when they were present. The air felt tighter, less forgiving. The awareness she relied on grew erratic, as though reacting to resistance. It was during one such gathering that the manifestations became impossible to ignore. As Helen sat in trance, witnesses saw the white substance appear again, thicker this time, heavier. It emerged slowly, folding upon itself like damp cloth. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone reached forward instinctively before being pulled back by others. Helen did not see it. She felt only a pressure in her mouth and throat, an urge to remain still, to let whatever was happening complete itself. When the trance broke, she collapsed. People rushed forward, supporting her as though she had nearly fainted. The substance vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing solid, nothing that could be examined or explained. To believers, it was proof. To skeptics, it was opportunity. Rumors began to circulate about hidden fabric, swallowed material, deception. Helen heard them secondhand, carried to her by people who meant well but could not soften the words. "She's clever." Some said, "She's dangerous." Others warned. Helen listened and said nothing. She had never claimed to understand what was happening. She had never insisted anyone believe her. But belief and doubt no longer belonged to her. They belonged to the crowd gathering around her name. And the crowd was growing. Researchers began to appear. Men with notebooks, cameras, measuring devices. They asked questions politely at first, requesting permission to observe, to document. Some spoke of science, others of truth. Helen agreed to some observations and refused others. She trusted her instincts more than their credentials. Something about the way they watched her, hungry, expectant, felt wrong. They were not listening. They were hunting. One name began to surface repeatedly in these conversations. Harry Price. Helen had not met him yet, but she knew of him. Everyone in spiritualist circles did. Price was known for exposing fraudulent mediums with theatrical precision. He was admired by skeptics and feared by believers. His investigations were public, meticulous, and often humiliating. When his interest in Helen became known, Henry felt a knot settle in his chest. "This man doesn't come to understand," he said. "He comes to win." Helen felt it too. Something in her recoiled at the thought of bright lights, controlled rooms, strangers interrupting the delicate stillness she depended upon. Her trance was not a trick she could perform on command. It was fragile, easily broken by fear, suspicion, or force. Still, she did not stop. People needed her. The world was shifting again. Economic strain tightened lives. Loss pressed closer to home. And in times like these, people clung fiercely to whatever offered comfort. Helen found herself caught between two forces. On one side, the grieving, quiet, desperate, sincere. On the other, the watchers, skeptical, strategic, relentless. She could feel the tension growing each time she sat in the circle. The awareness within her no longer waited patiently. It surged, reacted, strained against the boundaries she had built. And late at night, after the rooms had emptied and Henry slept beside her, Helen sometimes sat alone in the dark and felt a familiar sensation return. Not a voice, not a vision, but the sense of being observed, as if something, some presence she had known since childhood, had begun to stir again. Not gently this time, but with urgency, as if warning her the world was paying attention now, and it would not look away easily. Helen Duncan first sensed the shift not through words, but through resistance. It crept into the room quietly, an invisible weight that pressed against her awareness before she ever closed her eyes. The circle felt tighter now, less forgiving. Where once there had been grief and openness, there was suspicion, calculation. People no longer came only to feel. They came to see. And some came to catch her. Helen did not need to look up to know who they were. Her body reacted before her mind did. Her breath shortened. The familiar inward descent, the one she relied on to enter trance, hesitated, as if something inside her were testing the ground before stepping forward. Still, she sat. Still, she closed her eyes. She had learned long ago that retreat only sharpened fear. The room waited. Somewhere within that silence, Helen felt the pressure rise again, behind her eyes, along her throat, down her arms. It was stronger now, less subtle. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She fought the instinct to open her eyes and break the moment. Then she felt it, the sensation she dreaded most, the cool, damp heaviness in her mouth. A sound rippled through the room, sharp, involuntary. Someone gasped. Another whispered a name under their breath. Helen stayed still, heart racing, every instinct screaming for her to stop. She did not see what they saw, but she felt their attention lock onto her like a physical force. When the trance finally released her, it was not gentle. Helen slumped forward, dizzy, disoriented, the world snapping back into place too quickly. Henry was at her side in seconds, steadying her before she could fall. The white substance was gone, but the damage was done. The room erupted, not in grief, not in reverence, but in argument. Some spoke excitedly, insisting they had witnessed undeniable proof. Others laughed under their breath. One man stood abruptly and announced that he had seen her swallow something earlier. Another demanded brighter lighting for the next session. Helen listened from a distance, the voices blurring together. She had never felt so exposed after that night. The rumors hardened, not whispered speculation, but claims. Claims of hidden cloth, claims of sleight of hand, claims of deliberate deception. Helen heard her name spoken in tones she did not recognize, sharp, confident, accusing. People who had never sat in her presence began to describe her with certainty. She's clever. She's practiced. She knows exactly what she's doing. Helen wondered if that was worse than being called a witch. Henry urged her to stop, not angrily, not desperately, quietly. "This isn't what it was anymore," he said one evening as they sat alone, the house finally silent. "They're not coming for comfort now. They're coming to test you." Helen knew he was right. And yet, she also knew something else. Stopping would not end it. It would only confirm what her critics already believed. The invitations continued, more formal now. Some from spiritualist groups, others from individuals who claimed to represent research societies. They spoke of observation, of documentation, of separating truth from fraud. One name appeared again and again: Harry Price. Helen finally met him in person in the early 1930s. He was polite, calm, almost charming. He spoke of science the way preachers spoke of God, with certainty and confidence. He assured her that if her abilities were genuine, controlled conditions would only strengthen her case, that exposure would silence critics. Helen listened, but something in her recoiled. Price did not look at her the way grieving people did. He did not watch with hope or vulnerability. He watched like a man inspecting a mechanism, waiting for it to fail. Still, she agreed to limited observation. Part of her wanted vindication. Part of her believed truth would protect her. That belief would cost her dearly. The controlled settings were nothing like her home gatherings. Bright lights replaced lamplight. Silence felt hostile rather than reverent. The watchers sat alert, ready to interrupt, to seize, to expose. Helen struggled. Her trance faltered under scrutiny. The awareness she depended on recoiled, erratic and strained. Her body reacted with panic she could not fully control. During one session, when Price introduced an X-ray machine into the room, Helen broke. The hum of the machine felt invasive, threatening. Her breath hitched. Her heart pounded. Something inside her snapped. She fled, out of the room, out of the building, into the street. Later, Price would describe the incident with detached fascination, framing it as evidence of guilt. He documented every detail, every misstep, every moment of distress as though it were a puzzle piece snapping neatly into place. Helen read his reports with a growing sense of disbelief. She did not recognize herself in them. Photographs circulated, grainy images showing crude shapes, cloth-like forms, objects that looked unmistakably human-made. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. To skeptics, the case was closed. To believers, the experiments had been sabotage. Helen stood between those worlds, increasingly isolated. And yet, despite everything, people still came. They wrote letters. They begged her to visit. They told her the accusations did not matter, that whatever she offered, real or not, had eased their grief when nothing else could. Helen felt torn in two. The world of science had rejected her. The world of belief clung to her. And somewhere beneath both, the awareness she had carried since childhood stirred again, uneasy, restless, no longer content to wait. Late one night, alone in the small room where so many had sat before her, Helen felt the familiar sensation return, not a vision, not a voice, but the unmistakable sense of being watched. This time, it did not feel gentle. It felt urgent, as if whatever had followed her through hospitals, grief, and silence was now pressing closer, aware, perhaps, that the world beyond the door was preparing to act. Helen did not yet know how far that world would go. She only knew that something had crossed a line, and once crossed, there would be no turning back. The moment Helen Duncan realized she was no longer fighting for truth, but for permission to exist, came quietly. There was no announcement, no single confrontation, just a gradual tightening of the world around her. After Harry Price's reports began circulating, doors closed without explanation, invitations were withdrawn. Some spiritualist groups distanced themselves, afraid of being tainted by scandal. Others defended her loudly, too loudly, turning her name into a banner in a war she had never wanted to join. Helen read the newspapers with a numb detachment. Fraud, deception, hysteria. The words appeared again and again, printed with certainty by people who had never sat across from her in a dim room, never felt the stillness that came before she spoke, never watched grief loosen its grip on someone's face afterward. The public no longer asked what she was. They decided, and once decided, they moved on. Helen tried to step back. For a time, she reduced the gatherings. She refused large rooms. She avoided publicity. She told herself that if she returned to quiet spaces, the noise would fade. It didn't. Instead, something worse replaced it. Watchfulness. At seances, she began noticing unfamiliar faces, men who did not grieve, did not ask questions, did not close their eyes. They sat rigidly, observing, counting, measuring. Helen felt it immediately. Her body reacted before her mind could rationalize it. The inward descent into trance became shallow, unstable. Her heart raced. The awareness she had once slipped into now resisted, as if sensing danger. And then came the court. The first conviction did not involve witchcraft. Not yet. In 1933, during a séance in Edinburgh, a light was suddenly switched on mid-trance. What had appeared in shadow became painfully clear under full illumination. A figure draped in crude fabric, its shape unmistakably artificial. The room erupted. Outrage, betrayal, shock. Helen barely remembered the moment. She remembered only the sudden brightness, the sharp intake of breath, the way belief shattered so loudly it felt physical. The police were called. The trial that followed was swift and unceremonious. Helen was charged with fraudulent mediumship and fined. The amount was not devastating, but the judgment was. For the first time, the law had spoken her name, and it did not speak kindly. Helen returned home after the verdict quieter than ever. Henry watched her move through the house as if it no longer belonged to her. She avoided mirrors. She avoided conversation. The awareness she had lived with for decades retreated, coiled tight and silent, not gone, waiting, despite the conviction. The gatherings resumed, not because Helen wanted them to, but because people would not let go. The world was edging toward another war. Anxiety seeped into daily life. News traveled unevenly. Rumors spread faster than facts. And death, once distant, began pressing closer again. People sought certainty, or at least comfort. Helen found herself back in dim rooms, surrounded by people whose fear drowned out skepticism. Mothers, wives, fathers. Their questions were not philosophical. They were urgent. Is he alive? Did she suffer? Is there anything after this? Helen felt the old pull return, stronger, heavier. The awareness surged back with a sharpness that startled her. It no longer felt passive. It felt reactive, as if responding not only to grief, but to pressure. And pressure was everywhere. Unbeknownst to Helen, her name had begun to circulate in places far removed from seance rooms, government offices, naval reports, security briefings. It started with a single incident that would later be written off as coincidence, or something far more troubling. During a seance in late 1941, Helen spoke of a naval disaster. A ship sunk, lives lost, details precise enough to cause unease. The problem was not what she said. It was when she said it. The sinking of HMS Barham was classified. News had been suppressed to protect morale. Families had been warned not to speak. Officially, the ship still existed. Helen could not have known, but she spoke of it anyway. Word spread quietly at first, then urgently, and when it reached the ears of those tasked with protecting wartime secrets. The question stopped being whether Helen Duncan was a fraud. It became something far more dangerous. How did she know? MI5 began to take interest, not because they believed she spoke to the dead, but because belief was irrelevant. Information had surfaced where it should not have, and in wartime, Britain. Unexplained information was a threat. Helen felt the shift before she understood it. Seances grew tense, faces grew unfamiliar. The silence felt watched. She sensed a tension that did not come from grief, but from intent. Late one night, alone after a gathering, Helen sat in the dim room and felt the familiar sensation return. Not the awareness she knew, something colder, sharper, as if eyes were no longer simply observing, but preparing. She did not yet know the law that would be used against her. She did not yet know that a statute written 2 centuries earlier, one she believed long dead, was about to be dragged into the modern world for her alone. But somewhere in the quiet, something old had been awakened, and it was already reaching for her. Helen Duncan never knew the exact moment the government began watching her. There was no knock at the door, no letter stamped official, no warning that her life had crossed into a different category. The change revealed itself only through atmosphere. Rooms felt heavier. Conversations ended when she entered. New faces appeared at seances. Men who did not bring photographs, did not ask questions, did not grieve. They sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes open, absorbing every movement. Helen felt it immediately. Not fear. Recognition. This attention did not feel human in the way grief was human. It felt structured, intentional, cold. The awareness inside her reacted badly to it. Where once it had flowed easily, now it hesitated, recoiled, tightened. Her trances became shorter, more erratic. She woke afterward with headaches that lingered for days. Her body trembling as though it had fought something unseen. Henry noticed. "They're watching you," he said one night, his voice low, careful. "I don't know who they are, but they're not here for comfort." Helen did not argue. She had begun to feel it too. What she did not know was that reports were already circulating through naval and intelligence channels. not reports of seances or ectoplasm, but of information, of names spoken, of ships mentioned, of details that should not have been known outside secure briefings. To the authorities, Helen Duncan was not a mystic. She was a problem. It did not matter whether she was lying, guessing, or somehow channeling imagination. What mattered was that people were repeating what she said, and in wartime. Repetition was enough to break secrecy. MI5 began discreet observation. Officers attended seances under assumed names. They took notes, compared timelines, looked not for spirits, but for leaks. Helen sensed them every time. Her body reacted violently to their presence. Her breath shortened. Her pulse raced. The inward descent into trance, once slow and familiar, now felt like stepping onto unstable ground. During one gathering in Portsmouth, the tension became unbearable. The room was packed. Too many bodies, too much anticipation. Helen felt the awareness surge sharply. As if pushed forward rather than invited, a white shape formed briefly in the darkness, enough to draw gasps. Then chaos. A lamp flared on. Chairs scraped back. Someone shouted. Hands lunged forward. The substance vanished before anyone could seize it. Helen collapsed. When she came to, she was surrounded not by comfort, but by authority. The raid that followed was swift and decisive. Police entered the room without ceremony, interrupting what little calm remained. Attendees were questioned. The room was searched. No hidden materials were found. No props. No costumes. That absence unsettled the officers more than evidence would have. Helen was arrested anyway, at first. The charge was small. Vagrancy, a placeholder, something to hold her while larger decisions were made. She was denied bail. That alone should have told her everything. Helen Duncan, working-class woman, mother, medium, was transferred to Holloway Prison. The place was not built for someone like her. Its walls were thick, its corridors echoing with despair. She passed women accused of theft, violence, murder. Some stared at her with curiosity, others with fear. Helen felt the awareness recoil completely. Whatever had accompanied her through childhood dreams, hospital corridors, and dim rooms withdrew into silence. Not gone, watching. Days passed without explanation. Interrogations were vague, indirect. Officials asked questions without revealing their intent. Who did she speak to before seances? Where did she receive information? Did anyone supply her with names or details? Helen answered honestly. I don't know. No one. I feel things. Her answers satisfied no one. Behind closed doors, the real debate unfolded. They could not prove espionage. They could not prove conspiracy. They could not prove fraud in a way that justified her detention. But they could not let her go. Someone, quietly, carefully, reached back into legal history, into a law that had not been used seriously for generations. The Witchcraft Act of 1735. It did not require proof of magic, only proof that a person claimed supernatural powers for gain or influence. It was perfect, old enough to feel distant, vague enough to stretch, powerful enough to silence. When Helen was informed of the charge, she laughed, not because it was funny, because it was unreal. A witch, in the 20th century, in the middle of a world war. She thought of her mother's prayers, of whispered village stories, of the fear that had always hovered just beneath the surface of her life. Now it had a name again, in her cell that night. Helen sat on the narrow bed and felt the silence press close. The walls were bare, the air stale, no lamplight, no circle of chairs, just her. And then, faintly, she felt it again. Not a voice, not a vision, the familiar sensation of presence. But this time, it did not feel patient. It felt like something old had been forced awake, and it was watching the world finally reveal its hand. The word witch followed Helen Duncan into the courtroom long before she did. It hung in the air like an accusation no one wanted to say aloud. Yet everyone felt. Reporters filled the benches. Curious onlookers whispered behind gloved hands. Some came expecting spectacle. Others came hoping to witness history bend. Helen entered quietly. She looked smaller than people expected, older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. She did not dress like a mystic or a performer. There were no symbols, no drama, just a working-class woman standing beneath a law written before electricity, before psychology, before the modern world had learned how to name fear without burning someone for it. The charge was read. Not espionage, not treason. Witchcraft. The court did not ask whether Helen Duncan truly spoke to the dead. That question was irrelevant. The law only asked whether she claimed to possess supernatural power and whether others believed her. Witnesses were called. Some spoke against her with rehearsed certainty, describing cloth, tricks, deception. Others defended her through tears, insisting she had brought them peace when nothing else could. The court listened to both sides with the same detached patience. Helen sat still. She did not interrupt. She did not protest. She understood something now that no one else in the room seemed willing to admit. This was not about truth. It was about control. The state did not care whether Helen's abilities were real or false. It cared that she existed in a space it could not regulate, between belief and doubt, comfort and danger, secrecy and exposure. In wartime, ambiguity was unacceptable. The prosecution framed her as a manipulator of grief, a woman who preyed on vulnerability. They spoke of ectoplasm and spectacle, of crowds drawn into emotional frenzy. They avoided the words comfort and loss as if those might humanize her. Helen was given a chance to speak. Her voice was steady. "I never claimed to be powerful," she said. "I never asked anyone to believe me. People came because they were hurting. I listened." The room shifted. Not sympathy, recognition. But recognition was not enough. The verdict was delivered with the calm efficiency of a machine that had already decided its outcome. Guilty. Not because she had broken the modern world, but because the modern world had found an old tool that still worked. Helen was sentenced to prison. As she was led away, she felt something loosen inside her. Not relief, not despair, clarity. The awareness that had followed her all her life, the one she had tried to ignore, suppress, understand, was no longer the most frightening presence in her world. Power was. Holloway Prison swallowed her without ceremony. Days blurred into routine. Lock, unlock, count, silence. The women around her spoke in fragments, stories broken by exhaustion, anger dulled by time. Helen listened the way she always had, absorbing without comment. Her body weakened quickly. The trances never came. The presence remained distant, watchful, as if waiting for something to finish. Letters arrived. Supporters wrote in shaking handwriting, calling her brave, persecuted, chosen. Critics wrote with venom, celebrating her fall. Helen read none of them more than once. What mattered was not what people believed anymore. It was that belief had been judged dangerous. Her health declined steadily. Doctors noted heart trouble, weakness, breathlessness. Requests for release were delayed. Paperwork moved slowly when urgency belonged to someone without power. Helen spent long nights awake, listening to the prison breathe, the echo of footsteps, the distant coughs, the sound of keys, and sometimes, very faintly, she felt it again. That familiar sensation, not urging her forward, not pulling her back, just present, as if to say, "This is the cost." By the time officials finally agreed to release her on medical grounds, the damage was already done. Helen Duncan left prison thinner, slower, her body no longer able to carry what it once had. The world outside felt strange, louder, harsher. People stared. Some avoided her gaze entirely. She did not return to seances. She did not need to. The state had already spoken. Helen died not long after her release, quietly, without ceremony. No spirits appeared. No final message was delivered. Just a woman whose life had been shaped and finally broken by a question the world was too afraid to answer. Was she a fraud? Or was she simply someone who reminded people that death, grief, and uncertainty cannot be legislated away? The law that condemned her would eventually be repealed. Too late for Helen Duncan, but not too late for the question she left behind. And that question still waits, uncomfortable, unresolved, in the space between belief and power, where truth has never been safe. Helen Duncan did not die the way people expected her to. There was no final confession, no dramatic revelation, no last-minute vindication. She died quietly, as she had lived for most of her life, away from the crowds that once packed into darkened rooms, away from the voices that argued over her name as if it were a symbol rather than a person. Her body gave out before the world finished debating her. By the time the prison gates opened for the last time, Helen was already a diminished version of herself. Her steps were slower, her breath shallow. The sharp inward awareness that had once surged so easily now arrived only in faint echoes, like a memory of pressure rather than the thing itself. Doctors called it heart failure. Supporters called it injustice. Critics called it consequence. Helen did not call it anything. She returned to a life that no longer fit her. The house felt smaller, the silence heavier. Henry watched her with the careful attentiveness of someone afraid that even speaking might cause harm. He did not ask about prison. He did not ask about spirits. He understood that whatever had happened there had taken something that would not come back. At night, Helen sometimes woke with the sensation that someone had just left the room, not entered, left. It was different from the presence she had known all her life. This felt thinner, distant, as if something had withdrawn beyond reach. Not in anger, but in resignation. She did not miss it, not anymore. What troubled her more was the absence of noise. For decades, people had come to her in grief. Their sorrow had pressed against her senses until it shaped her days and nights. Now, there was nothing. No chairs scraping the floor, no whispered questions, no hands clasped in hope. The world had moved on. New crises replaced old fears. New names filled newspapers. Helen Duncan became a footnote, mentioned occasionally as a curiosity, a scandal, an embarrassment best forgotten. And yet, something refused to disappear. Years later, long after Helen was gone, people began to ask the question no court had dared to answer properly. Why her? There had been other mediums, louder ones, richer ones, more theatrical ones. Many had been exposed. Many had been mocked. Few had been imprisoned under a law older than their great-grandparents. What made Helen Duncan different? The answer, inconvenient and unsettling, lay not in ectoplasm or seances, but in timing. Helen had lived at the intersection of three things governments fear most: grief, uncertainty, and uncontrolled information. In a world at war, grief was everywhere, uncertainty was unavoidable, but information was supposed to move in one direction only, from the state to the people, never the other way around. Helen broke that order, whether by coincidence, intuition, or something no one could explain. She spoke of something she should not have known, and in doing so, she crossed from being a social nuisance into something far more dangerous, an unknown variable. The Witchcraft Act was not used because anyone truly believed Helen was a witch. It was used because it was available, because it was vague, because it was flexible, because it allowed the state to say, "This ends now." Years after her death, the law was repealed quietly, without apology. No official acknowledgement was made of Helen Duncan's case, no restitution, no formal admission of error. The state does not apologize to ghosts, but people remembered, not because of proof, not because of belief, but because her story revealed something uncomfortable, that societies do not persecute what they understand. They persecute what they cannot control. Helen Duncan never asked to be believed. She never asked to be protected. She simply listened to grief, to silence, to the spaces people avoid looking into too closely. And for that, she paid the highest price. The question she left behind remains unresolved, not because it lacks an answer, but because answering it would require admitting something far more unsettling than the existence of spirits, that power, when afraid, will always choose certainty over truth, and it will always find a name, old or new, to justify the choice. Helen Duncan's name was simply the one it chose that time. The room eventually went quiet again, but the silence she left behind still listens back. For a time after Helen Duncan's death, silence did what it always does best. It smoothed things over. No trials, no debates, no headlines demanding answers. The war ended. Cities rebuilt. New fears replaced old ones. Britain learned how to move forward by deciding, collectively, what was no longer worth remembering. Helen Duncan fit neatly into that category, officially. She was a fraud who had been dealt with under the law. Unofficially, she was an embarrassment, evidence of a moment when the modern state had reached backward into superstition to solve a problem it did not know how to name. So her name faded, but it did not disappear. Among spiritualists, her story hardened into legend. To some, she became a martyr, proof that the government feared what it could not explain. To others, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily belief could tip into self-deception. And then there were those who did not belong to either camp: historians, legal scholars, people who were less interested in ghosts than in power. They noticed something strange. Helen Duncan had not been convicted because she fooled people. She had been convicted because people listened to her. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was never about magic. It had been designed to punish those who claimed supernatural authority in a way that disrupted social order. It was a tool meant to control influence, not belief. And Helen, whether she intended to or not, had influence. She spoke into the most fragile parts of human experience: death, loss, fear. And she did so outside any institution the state could regulate. She was not a priest, not a doctor, not an official voice. She was a working-class woman sitting in a chair, asking people to close their eyes. That alone was enough to make her dangerous. Decades later, when declassified documents began to surface, the outlines of her case became clearer. Not cleaner, but clearer. There were no memos stating that Helen Duncan truly possessed forbidden knowledge, no smoking gun proving espionage or conspiracy. What existed instead were notes filled with discomfort, concerns, unease. The repeated phrase, "cannot be explained." That phrase appeared again and again, and in wartime, what cannot be explained cannot be tolerated. Helen's mention of the HMS Barham remained the fulcrum around which everything turned. Whether she guessed, whether someone spoke carelessly, whether grief carried rumor faster than censorship could contain it, none of that mattered. The information surfaced, and once surfaced, it could not be allowed to surface again. The state did not need to prove Helen was a witch. It needed to make an example. Years passed, generations changed. The Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1951, replaced with laws that framed fraudulent mediumship in secular terms. The language modernized. The intent did not. Helen Duncan's name was never officially cleared, but it lingered in the margins. Footnotes in legal texts, quiet conversations among those who noticed patterns in how power behaves when cornered. Her story raised a question that made people uncomfortable because it had no clean answer. What happens when a society encounters something that exists in the space between belief and fact? Not false enough to dismiss, not provable enough to accept, something that disrupts order simply by refusing to fit. Helen Duncan lived in that space, and the state closed it. Today, her story resurfaces periodically, on podcasts, in documentaries, in late-night conversations where skepticism and curiosity sit uneasily side by side. She is introduced with dramatic flair, the last woman imprisoned for witchcraft. But that title, as striking as it is, misses the deeper truth. Helen Duncan was not imprisoned for witchcraft. She was imprisoned for ambiguity, for reminding people that certainty is often an illusion maintained by authority, for revealing, intentionally or not, that grief opens doors the state cannot guard forever. Her life asks an uncomfortable question of anyone willing to listen. If Helen Duncan were alive today, would the outcome really be different? The laws would change, the language would soften, the courtroom would look more modern, but the fear of what cannot be controlled, would remain exactly the same. And somewhere, in some quiet room, the silence would still be listening back, long after Helen Duncan was gone. People began to notice a pattern, not in what she did, but in how the world reacted to her. Every retelling tried to simplify her, believer or fraud, victim or manipulator, but the more closely her story was examined, the less those categories held. Helen had never claimed certainty. She had never demanded authority. She did not found a movement or write a doctrine. She did not challenge the state directly, and yet, the state responded as if she had. That contradiction unsettled those who looked deeper, because if Helen Duncan posed such a threat without ever raising her voice, then the danger was not in her claims, but in the space she occupied. She sat at the intersection of things modern society prefers to keep separate: private grief and public order, faith and evidence, silence and speech. Helen did not shout truths into the world. She let people bring their own questions into the dark, and that made her impossible to regulate in the years after her death. Former attendees of her seances spoke sparingly, as if unsure whether remembering her was itself a risk. Some described her presence as calming. Others admitted they had suspected trickery even as they found comfort in it. What united them was not belief. It was the feeling of having been seen. Helen had listened when institutions could not. She had held space where doctors ran out of words, where priests offered answers that did not fit the shape of loss. that did not make her right, but it made her necessary to those who came, and necessity outside authority is always a problem. As archives opened and scholars revisited her case, one detail stood out repeatedly. Helen Duncan was never given a chance to be irrelevant. She tried to step back. She reduced gatherings. She avoided publicity. She complied when asked to submit to scrutiny. She endured humiliation in laboratories and courtrooms. None of it mattered. Because once the question had been asked, how did she know? The machinery of power could not un-ask it. The state had crossed a line of its own. It had reached back into history to silence a modern woman, then quietly moved on as if nothing unusual had occurred. The Witchcraft Act was repealed without ceremony, its existence framed as an anachronism rather than a weapon. Helen Duncan became collateral damage in that reframing. No apology followed, no acknowledgement of harm. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried weight. In later years, when people spoke of Helen, they often did so in hushed tones, as though something about her story still resisted full daylight. She unsettled skeptics who wanted clean debunkings and believers who wanted pure miracles. She belonged to neither, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling truth of all. Helen Duncan forced people to confront something they preferred to avoid. That not all questions exist to be answered. Some exist to expose the limits of control. Her life revealed how quickly a society that prides itself on reason will abandon it when faced with uncertainty it cannot absorb. How easily progress will borrow the tools of the past when fear outweighs principle. And how silence, when enforced, becomes a language of its own. Helen's silence, in the end, spoke louder than any seance ever had. It spoke of a world that demands clarity at any cost, of systems that fear the unclassifiable, of power that mistakes control for truth. She left behind no doctrine, no proof, no final message, only a story that refuses to stay settled. And perhaps that is why, decades later, people still return to her, not to decide whether she was right or wrong, but to ask a different question altogether. What does it mean when a society chooses certainty over compassion? In that question, Helen Duncan still exists, not as a witch, not as a fraud, but as a reminder that some silences are not empty. They are waiting. Long after the last courtroom emptied, long after the prison gates closed behind Helen Duncan for the final time, her name began a second life, one she could no longer control, shape, or escape. It lived in conversations that started with, "Did you know?" in documentaries that framed her as a mystery, in arguments where people chose sides before hearing the whole story. Helen Duncan became an object, a symbol, a warning, a curiosity. But symbols are easier than people. In the years following her death, Britain preferred to remember progress rather than discomfort. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed in 1951, replaced by cleaner language, modern statutes, and the reassuring sense that such things belonged to a darker past. The repeal passed quietly. No mention of Helen Duncan, no acknowledgement of why the law had been used when it was. History, after all, often corrects itself without admitting fault. But outside official records, memory moved differently. Among those who had sat in her circles, men and women now grown old, Helen remained vividly human. They remembered her hands resting loosely in her lap, the way her breathing changed before she spoke, the absence of theatrics that made her so difficult to categorize. Some admitted they no longer knew what they believed about her abilities. What they remembered instead was how she made the room feel safer, if only for an hour. That mattered more than proof. In academic circles, her case became something else entirely. Law professors cited her trial as an example of legal elasticity, how vague statutes could be revived under pressure. Sociologists pointed to her as evidence of how societies treat figures who operate outside sanctioned authority. Psychologists debated whether Helen herself believed what she experienced, or whether belief was beside the point. Again and again, the same conclusion surfaced. Helen Duncan was not dangerous because she challenged reality. She was dangerous because she bypassed institutions. She did not require permission. She did not carry credentials. She did not speak the language of power. She sat with grief and let it speak for itself. And grief, left uncontained, is unpredictable. As decades passed, new generations encountered her story stripped of context and complexity. Headlines simplified her into a phrase, "The Last Witch." The phrase traveled well. It fit neatly into marketing copy and late-night television. It made her story feel distant, almost folkloric. But the closer one looked, the less comfortable that distance became. Because Helen Duncan did not live in a medieval village. She lived in the modern world. She rode trains. She read newspapers. She stood in courtrooms with electric lights overhead. And still, when fear outweighed tolerance, the language of witchcraft returned. That realization unsettled people. If it happened then, what else could happen now? The question lingered quietly beneath every retelling. In moments of social stress, war, pandemic, unrest, societies reveal what they truly fear. Not falsehoods, but uncertainty. Not lies, but loss of control. Helen Duncan existed entirely within that uncertainty. She never claimed mastery over death. She never demanded belief. She simply refused to stop listening when others looked away. And listening, it turned out, was enough. Her story did not end with her death because the conditions that shaped it never disappeared. The tools changed. The language evolved. The fears remained. Whenever people ask whether Helen Duncan was a fraud or a victim, they are really asking something else. They are asking whether a society can tolerate spaces it does not own, whether it can allow comfort to exist outside regulation, whether it can admit that not all human needs fit inside systems designed for order so far. History's answer has been consistent, and that is why Helen Duncan's name still resurfaces, not as a ghost, but as a mirror, one that reflects not what we believe about the dead, but what we fear among the living. History did not erase Helen Duncan. It simply learned how to step around her. Textbooks summarized her case in a paragraph. Legal references mentioned the Witchcraft Act's repeal without examining the human costs that preceded it. Media retellings focused on spectacle, ectoplasm, seances, scandal, because spectacle is easier than responsibility, and so Helen became manageable. But in the margins, where history is less tidy, her story continued to trouble those who lingered too long. Researchers who read trial transcripts noticed how little evidence had actually been required, how testimony based on belief was accepted when belief served authority, how ambiguity, normally the enemy of law, became its greatest asset. Helen Duncan was convicted not because the state proved what she was, but because it decided what it needed her to be. That distinction matters. In later decades, other figures would occupy similar spaces. People whose influence flowed outside institutions, whose voices reached the grieving, the frightened, the uncertain. Some would be called cult leaders, others conspiracy theorists. Others still would be labeled dangerous simply because they attracted attention the state did not direct. The pattern repeated. First, disbelief. Then, ridicule, then scrutiny. Finally, control. Helen Duncan's case was not an anomaly. It was a template. What made her story unsettling was not its strangeness, but its familiarity. Strip away the language of spirits and witchcraft, and what remained was a woman punished for operating in a space that power could not map. She offered meaning without authorization, and authorization, more than truth, is what systems defend. Those who revisited Helen's life often found themselves stuck on a single moment, the decision to charge her under the Witchcraft Act. It felt absurd, an overreaction, a relic dragged into the 20th century. But absurdity can be effective. Old laws carry a particular strength. They arrive with the weight of tradition. The implication that this has worked before, they bypass debate by invoking continuity. The Witchcraft Act did exactly what it was designed to do. It ended the problem. Helen Duncan stopped speaking publicly. Her gatherings ended. The flow of uncontrolled comfort was cut off. The cost, to her body, her life, her dignity, was not part of the calculation. And once the problem ended, the law could sleep again. That is how history prefers to function. Quiet solutions, quiet forgettings. But forgetting does not mean resolution, in private letters. Some officials later admitted discomfort, not regret, never regret, but unease, a sense that something had been mishandled, even if it had been handled efficiently. Efficiency is not the same as justice. Helen's supporters, scattered and aging, wrote petitions that went unanswered. They asked for acknowledgement, for review, for something that resembled apology. None came. The state had no incentive to reopen a chapter that ended neatly. And yet, every time the Witchcraft Act was mentioned, every time its repeal was celebrated as progress, Helen Duncan's name surfaced again, quietly undermining the narrative. Progress without accountability is fragile. It depends on not looking too closely, in the end. Helen Duncan did not haunt Britain. She embarrassed it. Her story lingered as proof that modern societies are not as far removed from their past as they like to believe. That when fear escalates, reason often narrows. That old tools are never truly abandoned, only shelved. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that compassion, when unregulated, is often treated as a threat. Helen's life had revolved around listening to grief, listening to silence, listening to what people could not say out loud. The world answered by refusing to listen to her. That imbalance, who is heard and who is silenced, did not die with Helen Duncan. It continues, reshaped, renamed, and justified in new language, which is why her story refuses to stay in the past. It keeps resurfacing whenever society is forced to choose between understanding and control, and too often, the choice is the same. If Helen Duncan's story ended with her death, it would be tragic, but it didn't end. It repeated. Long after her name faded from headlines, the structure of what happened to her remained intact, quietly embedded in how modern societies respond to uncertainty. Different faces, different language, same mechanics. First comes discomfort, then comes classification, then comes elimination. Helen had triggered discomfort simply by existing where the rules were unclear. She did not break laws in the way criminals do. She broke expectations. She made people confront grief without a script, loss without permission, meaning without authority. That is harder to tolerate than deception, because deception can be exposed. Uncertainty has to be contained. Those who later studied her case noticed something unsettling. At every stage, the system behaved rationally, from its own perspective. The police acted to maintain order. The courts applied an existing statute. The government protected wartime secrecy. No single decision appeared monstrous on its own, and yet, together, they destroyed a woman. That is how systems harm without ever feeling cruel. Helen Duncan did not face a villain. She faced alignment. Every institution she encountered agreed, implicitly, that she was inconvenient, that it was safer for everyone if she stopped, and once that consensus formed, the outcome was inevitable. This is why her story still matters, not because of ectoplasm, not because of seances, but because it reveals how easily a society can convince itself it is acting reasonably while committing something profoundly unjust. When people ask whether Helen Duncan was a fraud, they are asking the wrong question. The better question is this: why did it matter so much? If she was merely a charlatan, ridicule would have sufficed. Exposure would have ended her influence. Fraud trials existed. Skeptics were vocal. The tools to dismiss her were already available. Yet the state chose the most extreme option it could legally justify. It chose to silence. That choice exposes fear, not of spirits, but of instability. Helen's case sits alongside others, past and present, where individuals who attract unsanctioned trust are reframed as threats, where the issue is not what they say, but who listens. Trust is power, and power that cannot be regulated is intolerable. Helen never sought followers. She never organized. She never declared herself special. But people trusted her anyway, because she listened when no one else would. That kind of trust bypasses institutions. It doesn't ask for credentials. It doesn't wait for approval. And that is why it provokes such forceful responses. Years after Helen's death, a former legal clerk involved in her case reportedly remarked that it had been unfortunate, but necessary. Necessary for whom? For the families who lost her comfort? For a society that needed reassurance? Or for a system that needed to remind itself it was still in control? Helen Duncan's life forces us to confront a disturbing possibility: that modern societies do not fear superstition. They fear alternatives. Alternatives to official narratives. Alternatives to regulated comfort. Alternatives to who is allowed to speak into human pain. Helen offered an alternative, not a doctrine, a presence, and presence, when it cannot be managed, becomes intolerable. Her story lingers not because it is strange, but because it is familiar, because the same dynamics appear again and again. Whenever fear outruns empathy, different era, different language, same outcome. Someone steps outside the approved framework. Attention gathers. Authority reacts. And afterward, history explains it away as an exception. Helen Duncan was not an exception. She was an early warning, a reminder that progress does not eliminate old fears. It only disguises them. That witch hunts do not disappear. They evolve. And that silence, once enforced, does not forget who it was used against. Helen Duncan never asked the world to believe her. She asked it, without words, to sit with uncertainty. The world answered by standing up and reaching for the oldest tool it could still justify. And that choice, more than anything else, is what keeps her story alive. What happened to Helen Duncan did not require hatred. It required procedure. By the time the machinery of the state turned fully toward her, emotion had already been stripped away. There were no shouting mobs, no torches in the street, only forms, briefings, reports stamped confidential. Fear does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives wearing a badge. The men who watched Helen did not believe in spirits. That was never the issue. They believed in patterns, in leaks, in risk. And Helen, unpredictable, unsanctioned, listened to, fit the profile of something that needed to be contained, not destroyed, contained. In wartime Britain, containment was survival. Everything that did not serve morale or control was suspect. Rumors were threats, grief was volatile, and anyone who spoke with authority outside the official chain, especially to large groups, became a liability. Helen did all of this without intending to. She never stood on a stage, never claimed prophecy, never positioned herself as a leader. She sat in chairs, closed her eyes, let people talk. But people left believing something had touched them. And belief spreads faster than orders. The intelligence officers who attended her seances did not record emotions. They recorded details, names, times, reactions. They noted when the room fell silent, when people gasped, when attention sharpened. They were mapping influence from their perspective. Helen Duncan was not a woman, she was a node, and nodes can be removed. This is where her story becomes uncomfortable, not because of mysticism, but because of its banality. Nothing extraordinary was required to end her public life. No grand conspiracy, no secret tribunal, just agreement. Agreement that she was a problem. Agreement that existing laws were insufficient. Agreement that older ones could be repurposed. That agreement formed quietly, without debate, because it felt practical. Helen was not asked to stop. She was not negotiated with. She was processed. The Witchcraft Act was simply the cleanest tool available. It carried history's authority without demanding proof. It reframed the issue away from security failures and into personal misconduct. It transformed a state problem into a personal one, and once transformed, it could be punished. This is how fear protects itself. It does not argue. It categorizes. Helen Duncan was categorized as disruptive, misleading, dangerous to public order. Her humanity became irrelevant. Inside Holloway Prison. Helen felt this more clearly than she ever had before. Not through cruelty. There was little overt cruelty, but through indifference. She was not interrogated as someone important. She was handled as someone inconvenient. The routines erased individuality. The silence stripped away context. Her body weakened rapidly under stress and confinement. The awareness she had lived with for decades withdrew completely, leaving behind only exhaustion and a dull ache of loss. Not spiritual loss, human loss. She missed the simple act of listening, the way people leaned forward when they spoke, the relief that followed being heard. Prison did not allow listening. It allowed obedience. When she was finally released, it was not mercy that opened the gate. It was efficiency. She was no longer useful as an example. The message had been delivered. Others would think twice now. Mediums grew quieter. Gatherings shrank or disappeared. Control had been restored. Helen returned to a world that had moved on without her. The war continued. Lives were lost and rebuilt. Her name slipped out of daily conversation, leaving behind only a faint trace of scandal. But something else lingered. A recognition, unspoken, but persistent, that what had been done to her had worked. And that knowledge settled quietly into institutional memory. Fear had learned it did not need fire. It needed paperwork. Helen Duncan's life ended not with flames, but with forms and files and laws no one wanted to revisit. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of her story, because it suggests that the mechanisms of persecution did not disappear with progress. They simply learned to dress better. If there was one thing the state did well after Helen Duncan, it was silence. Not forced silence. Normalized silence. There were no public statements declaring victory. No speeches explaining why a centuries-old law had been resurrected. No acknowledgments that something extraordinary had taken place. Because extraordinary things invite questions, and questions invite instability. Instead, Helen Duncan's removal faded into administrative success. Mediums took note. Spiritualist circles adjusted. Some stopped altogether. Others moved underground, careful to avoid attention, to keep gatherings small, to avoid language that sounded too certain. The message had landed. You can believe, but do not gather too many people. You can comfort, but do not influence. You can speak, but do not be heard too widely. No one needed to say it aloud. Fear does not need instruction when the example is clear. Helen's case was cited quietly in internal discussions, not as a mistake, but as precedent, as evidence that even in a modern democracy, the state could still draw a hard boundary around acceptable belief when conditions demanded it. It had worked. That is why it was never apologized for. Apologies suggest excess. Excess suggests error, and error invites accountability. Helen Duncan received none. Instead, her story was softened with time, retold as a curiosity, a strange footnote, something that belonged safely to the past, filed away under things we no longer do. But power does not abandon effective tools. It only waits. Years later, when scholars examined the language used in Helen's prosecution, they noticed how carefully it avoided absolutes. She was not accused of being a witch, only of claiming powers that influenced others. The wording was precise, defensive, designed to survive scrutiny. It was never about belief. It was about reach. Helen Duncan reached people the state could not, and reach, when uncontrolled, is dangerous. That realization has echoed through every era since. Whenever a figure emerges who attracts trust without credentials, who speaks into fear without authorization, the same unease arises, the same quiet assessments are made. Who listens to them? How many? Why? If the answers feel threatening, the response is rarely debate. It is containment. Helen's life ended, but the logic that consumed it remained intact. She had become a lesson, not officially, not publicly, but functionally. A demonstration of how ambiguity can be closed, how discomfort can be neutralized, how belief can be folded back into order without admitting that anything unusual occurred. That is why her story resists resolution. There is no villain to condemn, no confession to uncover, no clear injustice to correct without implicating an entire system. Helen Duncan was not destroyed by malice. She was erased by consensus, and consensus is the most difficult force to challenge because it does not look like violence. It looks like reason. In the years after her death, Britain congratulated itself on progress, on repealing outdated laws, on embracing science and modernity, and in many ways, it had earned that pride. But Helen's case remained like a hairline crack beneath the surface, easy to ignore, dangerous to examine too closely, because it suggested that progress had limits, that when pressure mounts, when fear spreads faster than explanation, modern societies will still reach for control over compassion, certainty over humility. Helen Duncan never asked for certainty. She offered presence. She offered listening. And for that, she was removed. Not because she was wrong, but because she could not be managed. That is the quiet truth her story leaves behind. And it is why, decades later, her name still unsettles anyone who takes the time to understand it. Not as a ghost, but as a warning. If Helen Duncan taught the state anything, it was not how to deal with spirits. It was how to deal with uncertainty. Her case demonstrated that ambiguity could be neutralized without spectacle. That belief did not need to be disproven, only redirected, contained, or quietly dismantled. And most importantly, that public comfort, when it exists outside sanctioned channels, can be treated as a threat without ever naming it as such. What Power learned from Helen Duncan was efficiency. There were no riots after her arrest, no mass protests demanding her release, no fracture in public order. Life continued. That outcome mattered more than justice, because power does not measure success in truth or fairness. It measures success in stability. Helen's prosecution created stability. Mediums recalibrated, gatherings thinned. People became careful about how loudly they believed. Fear did not vanish, but it learned to whisper. And whispering fear is easier to manage in that sense. Helen Duncan was not silenced to stop her voice. She was silenced to change everyone else's volume. That lesson did not stay in the 1940s. It echoed forward. Every time a society faces something it cannot easily explain, mass grief, collective anxiety, sudden shifts in belief, it returns, instinctively, to the same questions. Who is speaking? Who is listening? Who controls the narrative? Helen had never tried to control anything. That was the problem. She allowed meaning to emerge without structure. She let people sit with grief instead of resolving it. She let uncertainty breathe. Modern systems are not built for breathing uncertainty. They are built to close loops. That is why Helen's story continues to surface in moments of stress. Not because people suddenly believe in ghosts, but because they recognize the pattern. A figure emerges who operates outside institutions. Attention gathers. Authority intervenes. The justification changes with the era. Witchcraft, fraud, national security, public safety. Different words, same function. Helen Duncan sits at the crossroads of all of them. She is remembered as the last woman imprisoned for witchcraft, not because the charge was accurate, but because it was symbolic. It revealed how far a modern state was willing to reach backward to preserve control, and it worked. That is the part history is least comfortable with, because if it worked once, it can work again. Helen's story forces an uncomfortable admission that progress does not erase fear, it refines it. That institutions do not outgrow coercive instincts, they professionalize them. And that compassion, when it cannot be regulated, will always be seen as suspicious. Helen Duncan never left behind teachings or followers. She left behind an absence, a silence where something human had once been allowed to exist freely. That absence is harder to dismiss than any seance, because it asks a question no legal statute can answer. What happens to people when the only acceptable comfort is the kind approved by authority? Helen offered a different answer. Not an argument, not a doctrine, just listening. And listening, it turned out, was enough to provoke fear. The state learned that day that it did not need belief to be dangerous. It only needed people to care, outside its control. That lesson has never been unlearned, and that is why Helen Duncan's story does not end. It waits for the next moment when uncertainty becomes unbearable, and power once again decides that silence is safer than understanding. Long before the state decided Helen Duncan was a problem, ordinary people had already decided something else. They decided she mattered. Not because she was extraordinary, not because she promised miracles, but because she stayed. When grief hollowed people out, when official words sounded thin and prayers felt rehearsed, Helen sat in the quiet and did not rush them toward resolution. She did not correct their pain. She did not tidy it up. She let it exist. That alone set her apart from every sanctioned system designed to manage loss. Religion offered meaning, but it also offered rules. Medicine offered explanations, but it also offered limits. The state offered order, but never intimacy. Helen offered presence, and presence, when it cannot be categorized, becomes threatening. Those who came to her seances were not looking for proof. They were looking for relief from the unbearable weight of not knowing. Whether their loved ones still existed, whether death was final, whether love survived absence. Helen never answered those questions directly. She allowed people to ask them out loud, in a world that values certainty. Allowing uncertainty to speak is radical. The state understood this instinctively. Grief that is contained is predictable. Grief that gathers is volatile. Helen's gatherings created spaces where emotion moved freely, where people trusted something that did not wear a uniform or hold a license. That trust worried officials more than ectoplasm ever could, because trust creates allegiance. And allegiance that does not pass through official channels cannot be monitored, shaped, or redirected. Helen did not build a following intentionally, but one formed anyway. Not a movement, a network of people who believed, quietly, that someone outside the system understood them better than anyone inside it. That is the point where comfort becomes subversive. The state did not act because Helen challenged its authority openly. It acted because she bypassed it entirely. Once that was understood, the outcome became inevitable. From that moment on, Helen Duncan was no longer judged by what she did. She was judged by what she represented, a reminder that humans seek meaning where institutions fall silent, a reminder that suffering creates its own economies of trust, and that those economies do not always respect borders. Helen's imprisonment disrupted that flow. It did not erase grief, but it broke the pattern of gathering around someone unsanctioned. It reminded people that comfort, when public, must be regulated after her arrest. Many former attendees described a change, not in belief, but in behavior. They still mourned, they still wondered, but they became careful about where and how they expressed it. Fear had done its work. Helen Duncan had not been punished for speaking to the dead. She had been punished for letting the living speak freely. That distinction matters more than any debate about fraud or faith, because it reveals the true tension at the heart of her story. Not science versus superstition, not belief versus skepticism, but control versus connection. Helen represented connection that could not be owned, and so it was taken from her. What remains is not a mystery to be solved, but a pattern to be recognized. Every time grief becomes widespread, after war, disaster, or collective trauma, people seek spaces where pain is acknowledged without judgment. When those spaces arise outside institutional oversight, they are tolerated only briefly. Then come the labels, then the investigations, then the closure. Helen Duncan's life sits at the center of that pattern, not as an anomaly, but as an early modern example of how it works. Her story asks something uncomfortable of anyone willing to listen. If Helen had offered the same comfort under a different title, doctor, priest, counselor, would she have been left alone? Or was the real offense that she offered it without permission? That question lingers, and in that lingering, Helen Duncan still speaks, not through spirits, but through silence that refuses to settle. The comfort she offered could not be regulated, so it was removed, and that, more than anything else, explains why her story continues to matter. There was no document that stated where Helen Duncan crossed the line, no statute that clearly defined the moment when comfort became a threat, no policy outlining when listening turned into influence. That line existed only as a feeling, an unease shared quietly among those whose job it was to maintain order. Helen had never violated a written rule. She had violated an expectation. That meaning should flow downward from authority, not sideways between ordinary people in modern societies. That expectation is rarely spoken aloud. It is simply assumed. Doctors explain grief, priests interpret death. The state manages crisis. Each has a role, a hierarchy, a framework that keeps experience legible and contained. Helen had none of that. She did not diagnose. She did not preach. She did not regulate. She sat with people and let their questions remain unanswered. That unsettled those who relied on answers to maintain control. Because unanswered questions have a way of spreading. They invite conversation. They create bonds. They weaken the illusion that certainty is necessary for survival. Helen's seances were not dangerous because of what appeared in the darkness. They were dangerous because they normalized not knowing and still continuing to live, to grieve, to love. The state could not map that. It could not measure the relief people felt or the quiet strength some found afterward. It could only see gatherings, attention, influence moving outside approved channels. From that perspective, Helen Duncan was not an individual. She was a breach, and breaches are sealed, not debated. What makes her story uncomfortable is how invisible that line remains even now. We like to believe that modern freedoms are clear, that rights are well defined. But Helen's case shows something else, that as long as an activity creates unsanctioned trust, as long as it gathers people around shared vulnerability, it will eventually attract scrutiny, not because it is wrong, but because it is uncontained. After Helen's imprisonment, no law was written to prevent what she had done. No regulation clearly banned unsanctioned comfort. The state did not need to. The example was enough. People learned where the invisible line was. They learned that gathering attention without credentials invites consequences, that offering meaning without authority carries risk, that even harmless-seeming spaces can be reframed as dangerous if they escape control. Helen Duncan did not need to be remembered loudly for that lesson to persist. It was absorbed quietly. Years later, when similar figures emerged, faith healers, grassroots leaders, unlicensed counselors, informal networks of support, the same unease surfaced. Who do they answer to? Who is responsible if something goes wrong? Why do people trust them? Those questions are not inherently malicious, but they are often a prelude. Helen's story reminds us that the line between concern and control is thin and rarely written down. It shifts with circumstance. It hardens under pressure. In wartime Britain, that pressure was immense. The state did not fear Helen Duncan because she undermined truth. It feared her because she undermined dependence. She showed that people could find solace without official mediation. That grief did not need to pass through institutional hands to be valid. That realization, once glimpsed, is difficult to erase. So the line was enforced, quietly, decisively, and afterward. It was never spoken of again. Helen Duncan never knew exactly where she crossed it. Most people never do. They only feel the moment when the room changes, when attention hardens into scrutiny, when listening turns into surveillance. By then, the decision has already been made. Helen's life teaches us that freedom is not only about what is allowed, it is about what is tolerated, and tolerance, unlike law, is fragile. It bends, it contracts, it disappears under strain. The comfort Helen offered did not break any explicit rule. It broke an unspoken one. And that is why her story still resonates, not as a relic of superstition, but as a warning about how easily unseen boundaries can close around those who never meant to challenge them at all. She did not step over the line. The line moved, and when it did, it took her with it. Helen Duncan never realized that listening could be an act of defiance for most of her life. It had felt like instinct, a reflex, something she did the way others breathed or prayed. When someone spoke from pain, she did not rush to fill the space. She let silence do its work. That silence was not empty. It was shared, and shared silence has power. It allows people to feel less alone without being told what to believe. It creates connection without hierarchy. No one stands above anyone else when silence holds the room. That is precisely what made it dangerous. Institutions depend on roles, speaker and listener, authority and subject, expert and patient. These roles stabilize society, but they also define who is allowed to shape meaning. Helen erased those roles without intending to. In her circles, grief spoke for itself. Questions were not resolved. They were held. People left not with answers, but with a sense that their pain had been acknowledged without judgment. That kind of acknowledgement bypasses authority. It does not ask permission. It does not carry credentials. It spreads horizontally. The state could tolerate belief. It could tolerate doubt. What it could not tolerate was autonomy of meaning. When people find comfort outside sanctioned frameworks, they become less dependent on them, less predictable, less manageable. Helen Duncan's listening created that autonomy. And autonomy, when widespread, looks like disorder to those tasked with maintaining control. This is why her case cannot be reduced to a debate about fraud. Fraud implies deception for gain. Helen gained nothing lasting. Her life grew harder, not easier. Her body weakened. Her world narrowed. Whatever she received, attention, belief, scrutiny, was not chosen. It arrived because people sought her out. She did not shape demand. Demand shaped her. The state's response makes sense only when viewed through that lens. Helen was not silenced because she was false. She was silenced because she was effective. Effective at easing pain without oversight. Effective at gathering trust without authorization. Effective at reminding people that meaning can exist without official approval. That effectiveness was intolerable. After her imprisonment, something subtle changed in the social fabric. People became more cautious about where they shared grief, more careful about gathering around figures without credentials. Support retreated into private spaces, fragmented and isolated. Silence returned, but it was no longer shared. Helen Duncan's silence, enforced by law, did not remove uncertainty, it privatized it. Each person was left to carry grief alone, or within approved frameworks that often lacked the intimacy people had found in her presence. This is the quiet cost of control. Not oppression that announces itself, but absence that settles in unnoticed. Helen did not leave behind a movement to challenge this. She left behind a memory, a faint understanding, held by those who experienced her circles, that something human had once existed there, something not easily replaced. Years later, when people spoke of her, they often struggled to explain what they had felt. Not proof, not belief, relief. That word appeared again and again. Relief that someone listened without correcting. Relief that grief was allowed to be messy. Relief that uncertainty was not treated as failure. Helen Duncan offered relief, and relief, when widespread and unregulated, threatens systems built on control. Her story forces a recognition we rarely like to face. That power is often less threatened by opposition than by alternatives. Helen did not oppose the state. She offered something it did not know how to provide. And when power cannot replicate something, it tends to remove it. That is the lesson buried beneath the ectoplasm, the trials, the headlines. Listening, when it allows people to reconnect with themselves and each other, can be revolutionary. Not because it changes laws, but because it changes dependence. Helen Duncan changed dependence. So she was stopped, and the world learned, quietly, that some kinds of listening come with a price. Her story remains not as an argument about spirits, but as a reminder of something fragile and easily lost. That human connection, when left unregulated, can become the most subversive force of all. And that is why her silence still speaks. After Helen Duncan was silenced, nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. There were no riots when the séance rooms emptied, no headlines announcing a loss, no public reckoning with what had been taken away. Life went on, as it always does, absorbing absence without naming it. But absence has a cost. It just doesn't invoice immediately. In the years that followed, people continued to grieve. Wives lost husbands. Parents buried children. Wars ended and left their echoes behind. The official structures for dealing with loss remained intact. Churches, hospitals, government offices, carefully worded condolences. They functioned, but for some, something essential was missing. Those who had once sat in Helen's circles noticed it most sharply. They spoke of it rarely, often hesitantly, as if unsure whether naming it would invite judgment. "It felt warmer," one woman would say, trailing off. "There was time," another would add. "You didn't feel rushed to be better." What they described was not belief. It was permission. Permission to linger in grief without being corrected. Permission to speak without being evaluated. Permission to not know. When Helen was removed, those permissions vanished with her. The state had not intended to remove them. It had intended to remove a problem, but systems rarely account for the human byproducts of their solutions. What filled the gap was silence. Private, contained, isolated silence. People still suffered. They just did so alone. This is how control often reshapes society. Not by changing what people feel, but by changing where they are allowed to feel it. Helen's case drew an invisible boundary around collective vulnerability. It reminded people that gathering around unsanctioned comfort carried risk. That grief, when shared too freely, might attract attention. So grief retreated indoors, behind closed doors, behind polite conversations, behind phrases like, "I'm fine." The room closed, and with it, a certain kind of human connection disappeared. No law required this outcome. No decree mandated emotional restraint. It emerged organically, as people adjusted behavior in response to what they had witnessed. Fear did not need to be enforced again. It had been internalized. Helen Duncan's story is unsettling because it shows how easily this happens, how quickly people adapt to boundaries they never agreed to explicitly, how absence becomes normal when it is gradual. She did not die as a martyr. She died as a lesson, and lessons, once learned, shape behavior quietly, years later. When historians and commentators revisited her story, they often focused on the spectacle, the archaic charge, the absurdity of a witchcraft trial in the 20th century. Those details were easy to criticize from a distance. What was harder to confront was the aftermath, the way her removal narrowed emotional space, the way people learned to self-censor comfort, the way collective listening became suspect. These effects do not appear in court records. They appear in how people stop gathering. Helen Duncan did not create a movement, but she revealed a need when that need was abruptly cut off. It did not disappear. It scattered, and scattered needs are easier to ignore. This is why her story resonates differently over time. The further we move from the specifics of her case, the clearer its shape becomes. Not a battle between belief and skepticism, but a demonstration of how systems respond when something essential emerges outside their design. Helen's life showed that people will always seek spaces where they can be fully human, messy, uncertain, unresolved. When those spaces exist without permission, they are tolerated only briefly, then they are closed. The cost is not measured in laws or verdicts. It is measured in what people stop sharing, and that cost, once paid, rarely gets refunded. Helen Duncan's silence did not end grief. It reorganized it. And in that reorganization, something quietly human was lost. Something that no statute, repeal, or apology could ever fully restore. The room was closed, and the world learned how to live without it. Time has a way of smoothing even the sharpest edges, not by healing them, but by making them familiar. Years passed, then decades. The world changed its clothes and its language. New wars replaced old ones. New fears learned new names. And slowly, the absence left by Helen Duncan stopped feeling like a loss and began to feel like the way things had always been. That is how normalization works. No one wakes up one day and decides that something essential is no longer needed. They simply stop expecting it, stop looking for it, stop imagining it could exist. After Helen, grief was still acknowledged, but only in approved forms. Services had schedules, counseling had time limits, mourning had etiquette. Even trauma was given frameworks designed to move people forward as efficiently as possible. Forward mattered more than through. What Helen had offered, unhurried presence, unresolved listening, shared silence, did not fit into those frameworks. It did not produce measurable outcomes. It did not promise improvement. It allowed people to stay where they were. That was the problem. Modern systems are built on progression. They assume that pain is something to be processed, managed, and ultimately reduced. They struggle with the idea that some pain does not resolve, it only changes shape. Helen understood that instinctively. She did not try to fix grief. She did not interpret it away. She sat with it after her removal. That way of being with pain became rarer. Not because people no longer needed it, but because they no longer believed it was acceptable to seek it collectively. Grief became a private responsibility. If you struggled too long, you were encouraged to move on. If you asked too many questions, you were redirected to explanations. If you lingered in uncertainty, you were gently corrected. The message was subtle but persistent. Do not stay here. Helen Duncan had allowed people to stay, and that permission, once gone, reshaped how society related to loss. This shift did not require coercion. It happened through adaptation. People learned which expressions of grief were welcomed and which made others uncomfortable. They learned to compress their pain into manageable shapes, in that sense. Helen's silence accomplished what no law could have mandated directly. It changed behavior. Years later, when younger generations encountered her story, they often struggled to understand why it mattered. The world they knew already assumed that emotional expression should be guided, supervised, and resolved. The idea of sitting in a room with strangers, in silence, without clear purpose or outcome, felt alien, even risky. That reaction would have been unthinkable in Helen's time. Her story reveals not only what was lost, but how thoroughly that loss was absorbed. This is why attempts to rehabilitate her name never fully land. Clearing her record, posthumously acknowledging injustice, even apologizing, none of these actions restore what disappeared. They address legality, not culture. Helen's case was never only about a woman and a law. It was about a way of being with one another that became inconvenient. When that way was removed, society adjusted, not by rejecting it outright, but by forgetting how natural it once felt. This is the quietest kind of erasure, not the burning of books, not the banning of speech, but the gradual narrowing of what feels imaginable. Helen Duncan's life now reads like something from another world, not because of ectoplasm or seances, but because of the patience people once had for sitting with the unknown together. Today, uncertainty is often framed as something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Ambiguity is treated as failure. Silence is filled the moment it appears. Helen allowed silence to stand. That stance no longer fits easily into modern rhythms. And yet, the need it addressed has not disappeared. It surfaces in other ways. Support groups that struggle to find space. Online communities searching for connection. People gathering in informal ways to share pain without expertise or outcome. Whenever those spaces grow too visible, the old questions return. Who is responsible? Who controls this? What if something goes wrong? The line moves again. Helen Duncan's story does not belong to the past because the forces that shaped it are still active. They have simply grown more refined, more articulate, better at explaining themselves. Absence became normal, but normal does not mean natural. And sometimes, when silence stretches long enough, people begin to feel, without knowing why, that something is missing. Helen Duncan cannot return to fill that space, but her story reminds us that it once existed. And that knowledge, once rediscovered, is difficult to forget. Absence has a shape. It is not empty. It presses inward. Long after Helen Duncan faded from memory, that shape remained, subtle, unspoken, but present in the way people hesitated before speaking about loss, in the way conversations about death quickly shifted toward resolution, reassurance, or advice. The room where grief once lingered had not vanished. It had been resized, smaller, quieter, safer. For those in charge, Helen's seances were not important because of what appeared in them, but because of what didn't. There was no urgency to conclude, no demand to improve, no expectation of closure. People came as they were and left when they were ready. That rhythm disappeared after her. Modern life prefers efficiency. Pain is acknowledged, then directed. Time is allotted. Progress is expected. Even empathy is often framed as a step toward recovery rather than a space to remain. Helen offered no steps. She offered time. And time, unstructured, shared, unmonitored time, is increasingly rare. Those who try to recreate it now often do so instinctively. Without reference to Helen or her story, they gather in informal circles. They speak freely. They sit quietly together, and almost inevitably, questions arise. Is this safe? Is this appropriate? Who is responsible? These questions are not wrong, but they are revealing. They show how deeply the expectation of oversight has settled into collective behavior, how quickly unregulated connection is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a need to be honored. Helen Duncan's life did not end that need. It exposed how threatening it could appear. Her story survives not because she was unique, but because she represents a recurring tension, one that modern societies have never fully resolved. How much unstructured humanity can be allowed before it becomes inconvenient? How much shared vulnerability can exist before it begins to bypass systems designed to manage it? Helen never asked these questions. She lived inside them. That is why her story feels unfinished. Not because we lack information about her life, but because the conditions that shaped it still exist. We are still negotiating the same boundaries, just with different language. When people revisit Helen Duncan now, they often ask whether she was treated unfairly. The answer is yes, but that answer is incomplete. The deeper question is what we are willing to lose in exchange for control. Helen's removal made the world tidier, more predictable, easier to govern. It also made it lonelier. That trade-off is rarely acknowledged because it is difficult to measure. Loneliness does not appear in legal records. The loss of shared silence does not register in policy debates, but it accumulates quietly. Helen Duncan did not challenge the state with ideology or force. She challenged it by demonstrating that people could gather, grieve, and find meaning without permission. That demonstration was never going to be tolerated indefinitely. So the room was closed. And once closed, people learned to forget how it felt to sit there together. This is why her story continues to surface, not as proof of the supernatural, but as a reminder of something fragile and easily erased, that human beings need spaces where they are not managed, where pain is not optimized, where silence is not rushed. Helen created such spaces by accident, simply by listening. The cost of losing them was not paid all at once. It was paid slowly, in smaller gatherings, in shorter conversations, in the quiet assumption that grief is something to be handled privately. Helen Duncan did not leave behind teachings. She left behind a gap. And in that gap, we can still sense the outline of what once existed, if we are willing to sit long enough with the silence to notice it. Every story that refuses to end eventually stops being about the person at its center. Helen Duncan's story crossed that threshold long ago. By the time scholars, journalists, and filmmakers began returning to her case in earnest, they were no longer trying to understand her. They were trying to understand what her story revealed about themselves. Because once the spectacle fades, once the ectoplasm and the courtroom drama fall away, one question remains, quiet, persistent, impossible to dismiss. Why did this have to happen? Not how, not whether. Why was silencing her the chosen solution? That question has no comfortable answer, because it forces an admission modern societies resist, that some problems are not solved because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Helen Duncan was inconvenient. She did not fit the available categories. She was not fully fraudulent in the way skeptics preferred, not fully miraculous in the way believers hoped, not overtly political, not intentionally defiant. She existed in between, and systems built on clarity do not tolerate the in-between for long. What followed her case was not reflection, but avoidance, a collective decision to treat it as an anomaly, a relic of wartime panic, a strange moment when reason briefly failed. That framing is comforting. It allows us to believe the lesson has been learned, but history rarely repeats itself in identical form. It repeats in structure, and the structure of Helen Duncan's story continues to appear wherever uncertainty gathers people together without supervision. Whenever a figure emerges who speaks into pain without credentials, the same reflex awakens. First, curiosity, then skepticism, then concern. Finally, containment. The language changes, but the logic remains intact. This is why Helen's story unsettles people who prefer clean narratives. It does not resolve into heroes and villains. There is no singular act of cruelty to condemn, no obvious turning point where everything went wrong. Instead, there is alignment, institutions aligning around a shared discomfort, authorities aligning around a perceived risk, society aligning around the idea that order must come first. And alignment, once achieved, is difficult to resist. Helen Duncan did not lose her freedom because she was proven wrong. She lost it because too many people agreed that she should not continue. That agreement did not require belief in witchcraft. It required fear of instability. This realization forces an uncomfortable reckoning. If Helen Duncan were alive today, operating in a different medium, using different language, gathering people around shared vulnerability, would the response truly be different? The charge might not be witchcraft. The courtroom might look more modern. The justification might sound more reasonable, but the impulse would be familiar. Because the problem was never spirits. The problem was unsanctioned meaning. Helen's life exposed how fragile tolerance can be when confronted with collective uncertainty. How quickly societies retreat to control when ambiguity threatens their sense of order. That fragility did not die with her. It waits, in moments of crisis, in periods of mass grief, in times when official answers feel insufficient. Then, as now, people seek one another, and whenever they do so outside approved frameworks, the old question returns. Who is responsible for this? Helen Duncan never had an answer that satisfied power, and so power answered for her. That exchange between human need and institutional fear is the true heart of her story. Not what she believed, not what she claimed, but what her existence forced others to confront. The question did not die with her. It passed quietly to the next generation and the next, waiting for the moment when uncertainty once again becomes too loud to ignore. When people finally began asking the right question about Helen Duncan, they rarely liked where it led, because the answer was not hidden in seance rooms or court transcripts. It was not buried in ectoplasm or legal technicalities. It was sitting in plain sight. Helen Duncan was silenced because she revealed a weakness, not in science, not in religion, but in authority itself. Authority depends on mediation. It survives by positioning itself between people and their most vulnerable experiences: death, fear, uncertainty, and offering approved ways to process them. That mediation creates trust, structure, and stability. Helen bypassed it. She did not ask permission to sit with grief. She did not require credentials to listen. She did not promise resolution to justify her presence. She simply allowed people to face uncertainty together. That act, simple, unstructured, human, exposed something power does not like to acknowledge: that people can support one another without oversight. Once that possibility is demonstrated, authority loses exclusivity, and exclusivity is where power lives. Helen Duncan did not intend to challenge this arrangement, but intent is irrelevant when impact is sufficient. Power responds to effect, not motive. Her case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about modern systems: that they often tolerate dissent more easily than alternatives. Opposition can be debated, criticism can be answered, but alternatives suggest that something else might work, and that is destabilizing. Helen offered an alternative to institutionalized comfort. Not better, not worse, just different, and different, when it attracts attention, becomes intolerable. This is why the response to her was so disproportionate, why ridicule was not enough, why exposure was not sufficient, why an old law had to be resurrected to remove her entirely. The goal was not correction. It was closure. Close the room, disperse the gathering, restore the familiar channels, and move on. That goal was achieved. But the cost was buried rather than counted, because counting it would require admitting that something valuable had been lost, not because it was wrong, but because it could not be controlled. Helen Duncan's story unsettles because it does not allow us to remain comfortable skeptics or believers. It demands that we look instead at how we manage human vulnerability. It asks whether we truly believe people can be trusted with their own grief, whether we believe shared uncertainty is something to fear or something to hold, and whether order is always worth the price it demands. These questions are not historical. They are present. They appear every time informal communities form around pain, every time people gather outside institutions to make sense of loss, every time shared silence offers more relief than explanation, and each time, the same tension arises. Who controls this? Who answers for it? What if it goes wrong? Helen Duncan's life suggests another question should come first. What if it goes right? What if unregulated connection meets a need institutions cannot reach? What if listening without authority allows people to survive moments that official frameworks cannot touch? Helen's circles did not threaten the state because they challenged its power. They threatened it because they revealed its limits. That is a harder thing to forgive, which is why her story refuses to settle into the past. It reappears whenever systems feel strained, whenever grief overflows prescribed channels, whenever people begin to seek one another instead of answers. Helen Duncan did not leave behind proof of the supernatural. She left behind proof of something far more uncomfortable. That control is often mistaken for care, and that when care emerges outside control, it is treated not as a gift, but as a problem. The state solved that problem efficiently. The question is whether we are willing to see what was lost in the process. Because once seen, it cannot be unseen, and that, perhaps, is why Helen Duncan's story still unsettles those who listen closely enough to hear it. In the end, Helen Duncan did not leave evidence. She left a mirror. Anyone who looks into her story long enough eventually stops asking what she was and starts asking what we are, what we tolerate, what we fear, and what we are willing to erase when the world feels unstable. That is why her story feels uncomfortably modern, because nothing about it requires superstition to make sense. You do not have to believe in spirits to understand why Helen Duncan was silenced. You only have to understand how power behaves when it encounters something it cannot supervise. Helen was not dangerous because she lied. She was dangerous because she created meaning without permission. She did not need followers to do this. She did not need ideology. All she needed was a room, a chair, and the willingness to sit with people at their most exposed. That is enough. Every society draws a boundary around who is allowed to do that. Usually, it is done quietly, through credentials, training, licensing, institutional affiliation. These structures exist for good reasons. They protect people. They create accountability. But Helen existed outside all of them. And when people trusted her anyway, the system responded not with curiosity, but with closure. Her story becomes a mirror because it asks us to examine our own reflexes. When we encounter something that does not fit our categories, do we try to understand it, or do we rush to label it? When people gather around unsanctioned voices, do we ask why those voices resonate, or do we assume danger? When control and compassion come into conflict, Which do we instinctively protect? Helen Duncan forces these questions without ever asking them aloud. She lived the answers, and the answers were not flattering. What makes her story linger is not that she was wronged. History is full of wrongs, but that her removal felt, to many, reasonable at the time. That is the most unsettling part. Not cruelty, not fanaticism, but reasonableness. A calm agreement that something must be done. A shared understanding that order mattered more than discomfort. A quiet confidence that the cost was acceptable. That confidence is what the mirror reflects back at us. Because it suggests that the same thing could happen again, not under the banner of witchcraft, but under words we trust more. Safety, stability, responsibility, words that sound like care. Helen Duncan's life asks us to slow down when we hear those words used to justify silencing someone who offers connection without authority. It asks us to notice when discomfort is framed as danger, when ambiguity is treated as a threat, when human needs are recast as problems to be managed. Her story does not demand belief. It demands attention. Attention to the spaces we allow for grief. Attention to who is permitted to listen. Attention to how quickly we accept control as kindness. Helen never claimed to speak for the dead, but through her story, she speaks clearly to the living. She reminds us that progress does not mean we stop silencing people. It means we get better at explaining why we do it, and explanation, when smooth enough, can make almost anything feel justified. That is the mirror Helen left behind. Not a reflection of ghosts or frauds, but of a society that prefers order to uncertainty, management to presence, and silence to listening when listening becomes inconvenient. Whether we look away from that mirror or choose to sit with what it shows is the part of her story that has not yet been written, and perhaps never will be, because that part belongs not to Helen Duncan, but to us. Every story eventually reaches a place where it can no longer move forward. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because what remains can only be faced inward. Helen Duncan's story arrives there now, after the trials, the prison, the silence, after the years of reinterpretation and debate. One final door remains, quiet, unmarked, easy to avoid. It is the door that asks not what happened to her, but what we would do if placed in the same moment, because Helen Duncan was never extraordinary in the way myths prefer. She did not seek power. She did not challenge authority directly. She did not set out to disrupt anything at all. She listened, and listening, in a world built on control, turned out to be enough. That is the last door. The realization that no dramatic act is required to provoke suppression. No rebellion, no manifesto, no confrontation. Sometimes all it takes is a space where people are allowed to be human without supervision. Helen's life shows us that the most fragile freedoms are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones. The freedom to sit with grief without fixing it. The freedom to admit uncertainty without being corrected. The freedom to share silence without being managed. These freedoms leave no paper trail. They create no institutions. They do not announce themselves, which is why they are so easily taken. When Helen Duncan was removed, the world did not collapse. Nothing visibly broke. Order remained intact. That is precisely why her story matters. Because it shows how much can be lost without disruption. No one is forced to choose between good and evil. They choose between comfort and control. And control usually wins, not because it is cruel, but because it feels safer. Helen Duncan reminds us that safety is not the same as care. Safety minimizes risk. Care acknowledges pain. When care emerges outside approved structures, it becomes suspicious. When it spreads without permission, it becomes intolerable. Helen did not cross a legal boundary. She crossed a psychological one. She showed that people do not need permission to gather around grief. And once that is seen, it cannot be unseen, only suppressed. That suppression did not end with her death. It became part of the background. Today, we live in a world saturated with explanations, frameworks, protocols, and expert voices. We are taught how to grieve, how to heal, how to move on. And yet, loneliness grows. Not because people lack answers, but because they lack rooms where answers are not required. Helen Duncan created such rooms without naming them, without charging for them, without defining their purpose. She let them exist. The state closed them, not out of malice, out of fear of what could not be contained. This is the final truth her story leaves behind. Not a verdict, not a revelation, but a choice. Do we accept that some human needs cannot be regulated without loss? Do we allow spaces where people sit together without outcomes, oversight, or permission? Or do we continue to trade those spaces for order, quietly, reasonably, and without protest? Helen Duncan does not answer these questions. She hands them to us. That is the last door. Whether we open it or walk past it without looking is the only unresolved part of her story. And it is unresolved not because history failed to finish it, but because it was never hers to finish in the first place. When the door finally closed behind Helen Duncan, nothing dramatic echoed down the corridor of history. No warning bell rang. No lesson was announced. The world adjusted, the way it always does. What remained was not outrage, but habit. Habit is the most powerful inheritance a society leaves itself. It teaches people how to behave without telling them why. It tells them which questions are worth asking and which ones should be left alone. After Helen, the habit became clear. Do not gather too freely. Do not listen too openly. Do not let uncertainty last too long, especially not together. These habits were never written down. They did not need to be. They lived in raised eyebrows, in cautious advice, in the way people learned to redirect conversations before they became uncomfortable. They lived in silence. Helen Duncan's story ends not with an answer, but with residue, the faint outline of something that once existed and no longer quite does. A kind of listening that had no agenda. A kind of presence that did not rush toward resolution. A kind of human closeness that did not need to be explained to be justified. When that disappears, it does not leave a gap people can point to. It leaves a restlessness, a feeling that something is missing, without knowing what. This is why Helen's story resurfaces in times of collective strain, during wars, disasters, pandemics, cultural upheaval, moments when official explanations lag behind lived experience. People begin to look for one another again. They seek rooms without scripts, conversations without outcomes, silence that can be shared instead of managed. And almost immediately, the old questions return. Is this safe? Is this appropriate? Who is responsible? The same questions that once circled Helen Duncan. Her story warns us that these questions are not neutral. They carry within them an assumption that vulnerability must be supervised to be legitimate. Helen challenged that assumption simply by existing. She showed that people could sit with pain without being instructed, could find relief without being corrected, could be human without being optimized. That demonstration was never going to be allowed to grow. not because it was harmful, but because it was uncontrollable. The final irony of Helen Duncan's life is this: she was silenced in the name of public order. Yet what she offered was order of a different kind, not order imposed from above, but order emerging from shared experience. A quiet, organic rebalancing that happens when people are allowed to feel together without being told what those feelings should become. That kind of order cannot be legislated, it cannot be standardized, and so it is always temporary. Helen's rooms were temporary, her presence was temporary, but the need they answered was not. That need still moves beneath the surface of modern life, appearing wherever systems fail to reach the interior of human experience. And each time it appears, the same choice presents itself, though it is rarely framed as such. Do we allow this, or do we contain it? Helen Duncan's story does not accuse, it observes. It observes how easily reasonable people accept the narrowing of human space when fear demands it, how quickly silence can be mistaken for resolution, how comfortably loss can be managed when it is invisible. What remains, then, is not her guilt or innocence. What remains is the question of what we are willing to trade for control. How many quiet rooms must be closed before we notice what they offered? How much listening must disappear before loneliness feels like a permanent condition rather than a temporary state? Helen Duncan never asked these questions. She lived in their shadow, and when she was removed, the shadow remained, stretching forward, waiting for the next moment when uncertainty becomes inconvenient and the door feels easier to close than to leave open. That is what remains, not a ghost. Not a mystery, but a choice we keep inheriting, whether to silence what we cannot manage, or to sit, briefly and imperfectly, with what makes us human in the end. There is nothing left to explain. That is the final truth. Helen Duncan's story arrives at, quietly, without ceremony. No new documents will surface that change what happened. No confession will resolve the ambiguity. No definitive answer will close the case in a way that satisfies everyone. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Helen Duncan lived her entire life inside unanswered questions. She did not resolve them. She did not claim to. She made space for them, and for a brief moment in history, others were allowed to step into that space with her. Then the space was closed. What followed was not enlightenment, but efficiency, not healing, but management, not understanding, but silence carefully arranged to look like order. That silence remains. It shows itself not as oppression, but as absence, in the way grief is rushed, in the way conversations pivot away from discomfort, in the way we are taught, gently, reasonably, not to linger too long on what cannot be fixed. Helen Duncan's story ends here not because it has been completed, but because it has been absorbed into habit, into policy, into the invisible rules that shape how much of ourselves we are allowed to share. Her life does not haunt history as a scandal. It echoes as a pattern, a reminder that when societies feel threatened, they rarely ask what people need. They ask how to restore control, and control, once chosen, rarely leaves room for listening. Helen did not ask to be remembered, but she remains. Whenever someone notices the cost of silence, whenever someone feels the absence of shared space and wonders when it disappeared, whenever someone chooses to sit with another person's pain without trying to solve it, in those moments, something of what Helen offered returns, not as belief, not as spectacle, but as presence. And presence, though fragile, has a way of enduring. This is the last thing her story gives us. Not an argument, not a warning shouted into the dark, but a quiet invitation to notice when silence is imposed rather than chosen, to recognize when order replaces care, to remember that some of the most important human acts leave no evidence behind. Helen Duncan was silenced because listening could not be regulated. But listening did not disappear. It moved. It adapted. It waited. And even now, if you sit long enough, without agenda, without answers, you can feel it. The same silence Helen once